Hvala svima koji verno prate naše emisije i žele da pomognu u radu naše produkcije. Možete nas podržati simboličnom donacijom ili kupovinom naših proizvoda na sajtu balkaninfo.rs.
Poštovani gledalci, vi gledate intervju produkcije Balkan Info. Ja sam Aleksandar Pavković, naš današnji gost je gospodin Mišel Čosudovski. U pitanju je naš dragi gost koji nam dolazi iz Kanade. On je po struci ekonomista, ali je i čovek koji je prošao mnogo toga, inače i pisac i profesor ekonomije na Univerzitetu Otava. Osnivač je Centra za istraživanje globalizacije i samim tim možete čitati sve što je vezano za to na sajtu globalresearch.ca. Mnogo stvari je video u svom životu, mnogo toga preživeo, doživeo, a evo sad nam je velika čast i da je gost u našoj produkciji.
That's okay.
Drago mi je što ste naš gost i evo na početku da vas pitam kako se osjećate u Beogradu, da li se ovde može naslutiti neka, kako se u nekim medijima kaže, revolucionarna atmosfera?
I think the Serbs are people who have a feeling of solidarity, the way they communicate, the way they talk, they smile and they laugh and they make jokes, but they are also, given the history of Serbia, they have to address what happened in 1999.
Da, mi ćemo zauvek to pamtiti, ali pamtit ćemo i to što su postojali ljudi poput vas koji su na jedan objektivan način izveštavali o tome kada su svi išli, da kažemo, drvljem i kamenjem na srpski narod.
Well, what I observe today is that the younger generation in Serbia have not lived those events. And I think it's very important that it be the basis of their history in schools, universities, as well as in politics. Namely, what happened in Serbia was the destruction of an entire country. I should say what happened in Yugoslavia was the destruction of an entire country by NATO, and it was a criminal undertaking, and it has to go into the history books as such.
Da, to je bio pokušaj uništenja države i naroda, ali evo, mi smo uspeli da se sačuvamo nekako. Da li je sada veća opasnost kada ne padaju bombe na glavu ovde narodu u Srbiji?
Well, war is always there to instate changes at the economic and social levels. There's not a single war in history which doesn't have ultimate economic objectives. And what that war has achieved, and it started in fact in the 1980s with the dismantlement of the of the industrial system. But what that war has achieved is essentially destroying a societal project, and which was based on free education, health, and also on participation. It was not necessarily a fully socialist agenda. It was a mixed economy.
Ali da li vi, kao neko ko nije iz srpskog naroda, sa strane gledajući, možete da nam kažete na ono što nas zanima i što možda mi dalje ne znamo, a to je zašto smo mi targetirani od, ajde da kažemo, Amerike, odnosno Zapada. Zbog čega baš Srbi?
We should go back to the Reagan administration. There was already a document to the fact that Serbia would be the object of a military initiative. And I think we should understand that there is an imperial project, a hegemonic imperial project, and it emanates from the United States.
Ali zašto baš Srbi?
There's a timeline, and Serbia was the object of this project, this NATO project, pretty much at the time when the Cold War was over, right? And it was also coordinated with the transition. There were economic measures taken against the former Soviet republics, but also against a whole number of countries in Eastern Europe. We recall in 1989, Poland, the Big Bang, and then in 1990 there was a Big Bang in Yugoslavia, with essentially the breakdown of the federal structure, and also it's also a fiscal relationship between the central government and the governments of the Yugoslavian Federation.
Tu se razgrađivala Jugoslavija. Da li je zapravo unapred bilo isplanirano da Jugoslavija bude razbijena kao zemlja koja je možda imala neku ulogu? Da li Jugoslavija po vama imala neku ulogu između Varšavskog i NATO pakta?
Well, I think that is a correct statement, but there's another element. First of all, as I mentioned, the war started in the 1980s, and there's one element of the war which was the destruction of the entire industrial fabric. And from one day to the next, 600,000 workers lost their jobs. That was an act of war, of economic warfare. But I think there's another element there, is that Yugoslavia was non-aligned, and it had a lot of relations with developing countries. And the policies which were applied in Yugoslavia are very similar to those which were applied in Latin America or Southeast Asia, leading to the collapse of the real economy. It's a neoliberal shock treatment which was devastating in Yugoslavia, and it was combined with military support mechanisms. And the other element, bear in mind that many Western European countries have military bases, US or NATO military bases, including Italy, Germany, Turkey, Belgium, Holland, but Serbia not.
Formalno ima I Srbija.
Oh yes, yeah.
Ali ne svojom voljom. Ta baza nije izgrađena, da kažemo, time što je Srbija prihvatila to.
Ja.
Da li možete da nam kažete, u svetlu ovih dešavanja i ovih promjena u svetu, dakle, pobede Trumpa na izborima, onda najave da će biti završen rat u Ukrajini, da li možemo, i naravno razgovora Trumpa I Putina, da će doći do jedne prekompozicije sveta i koje bi mesto Srbija mogla da zauzme u tom novom svetu?
Well, first of all, I should say that the initiative of Trump in regards to reaching a peace agreement is very contradictory. I think everybody knows that. Meeting in Saudi Arabia is not the place where you should meet. And the Russians certainly have certain reticence. I would say that in present circumstances, given the fact that Serbia is neutral, it has relations with Russia and it has relations with the West and with the United States, that Serbia might be playing a role in peace negotiations. There's another element which is very important. This was NATO's first war. And when I say it was the first war, it sets the stage for all subsequent US-NATO wars. And all these NATO wars implied destroying countries. And in fact, what we might say is that Yugoslavia was a dress rehearsal. But the present-day wars are far more sophisticated because the technologies of modern warfare with artificial intelligence and so on, and also the whole propaganda apparatus and the flow of information is far more sophisticated. But essentially the premises of lying are there. And with regard to Ukraine, that several important elements which simply do not reach the public because they are object of censorship. One is that the war started in 2014 and it was a NATO initiative. It was a US-NATO initiative and it was a coup d'etat which involved Victoria Nuland, as we know. And consequently, we must understand that coup d'etat was supportive of two Nazi parties, Reichssektor and Svoboda. And the media has never really acknowledged the fact that it was a coup d'etat. And the media within Ukraine has not really acknowledged it either. I lived through two military coups in my life, one in Chile and one in Argentina, and everybody knew that it was a coup d'etat.
Da, to u Ukrajini sigurno je bio državni udar, pa bih hteo s tim u vezi da vas pitam kako je sada moguće završiti rat. Ja sam u ovim emisijama isticao neki moj stav da će verovatno i jedna i druga strana proglasiti pobedu. Trump pobedili smo, Putin pobedili smo, svako iz svog ugla, i da će zapravo jedini gubitnik ovog rata, odnosno najveći gubitnik ovog rata biti Ukrajina.
Well, Ukraine is the losing side of this war, but it must be understood that this was a war of US NATO against Ukraine and not against Russia. And that started in 2014.
Pošto ste to rekli, dakle, Ukrajina plaća cenu zablude da u ratu može pobediti Rusiju.
Well, I think that if you look at US military practice, they will always use their allies to do the dirty work. And they are careful not to involve too many US troops in the region. In fact, hardly, but they will have no hesitation in sending Italians or Germans or British to the front line. The war, this is, from the US point of view, this is not only a war against Ukraine, but it is a war against Russia. And I think we have to understand history. Russia has been the object of several wars, not necessarily all of them by the United States. We had the Napoleonic Wars. But I think it's important to stress the following. First of all, because history is also the object of censorship. The first war on Russia was in 1918, the 12th of January. It was barely a couple of months after the October Revolution, and it involved something of the order of 200,000 troops. Many Western countries were involved. Japan was involved. Canada was involved. The United States was involved. And that war started before even the completion of World War I. It started in January 1918, and it was not a war to come to the rescue of the Tsar. Now, there's another element regarding World War II. Operation Barbarossa started in, if I'm not mistaken, in June 1941, right?
On June 22.
Oh, June 2nd, 22nd, okay. I can't remember the day. I know it's in June 1941. Okay. Now, the Operation Barbarossa, led by Nazi Germany, the Third Reich, started in June 1941. Okay, and I think. One thing which is very important to underscore and has a lot to do with the history of World War II is that the Third Reich did not have access to large amounts of petrol, gasoline. And without gasoline, you cannot wage war on the Soviet Union. Now, what should be underscored is that Standard Oil of New Jersey, namely Exxon, provided oil to Nazi Germany right until 1945. And this was in violation of a 1913 law, which was called Trading with the Enemy. The government of Franklin D. Roosevelt were fully aware that Exxon was collaborating with Nazi Germany. But it was not the only one. It was also the Bush family. Okay, we know that the father of George Sr., it was his father was involved in investment in Nazi Germany. And that was Preston Bush. And so the Bush family has roots in Nazi Germany. They were not the only ones. And I think what is very important is that had the United States not collaborated with the Third Reich, there wouldn't have been a Second World War as we know it. They were allied with Nazi Germany, and they were allied with Nazi Germany even from 1934, when the federal representative from the Federal Reserve as well as the Bank of England met up with Adolf Hitler and financed his election campaign. And President Truman made statements to the effect that the objective of World War II is that the Germans and the Russians should kill one another.
A da li je tačno da je odmah nakon Jalte Churchill predložio Trumanu da se napadne odmah Sovjetski savez?
Yes, it is certainly that statement was made. There was an operation. The operation is documented, and it was essentially to focus on the troops which had advanced into East Germany and to wage war on them. The Allies then said, no, we can't do that because it's not, we would lose, essentially.
A da li možemo sada da kažemo da je, evo sada, najveći uz Ukrajinu, najveći gubitnik ovog rata zapravo Evropa i da ona baštini globalističku politiku koja je bila za vreme Demokratske partije u Americi?
There's a history on that the Soviet government was pushing for collaboration and trade with Western Europe right from the beginning. And this was also the object of their presentation at the Genoa conference in 1923, just after the war which was waged against them. And this was, Lenin was intent upon going, but he had problems of health, and his foreign minister Chicherin was sent to Genoa and had presented a project of what was called peaceful coexistence between East and West. Now, while the concept of peaceful coexistence prevails, that conference dismissed the Soviet proposal.
Da li je sada Evropa druga strana u odnosu na Ameriku? Jer do sada, do 20. januara ove godine, to je bilo jedno. Ok, lider je bila Amerika, Evropa je bila pratilac, da ne kažemo poslušnik, a sada su nekako Amerika je jedna strana, Rusija je druga, Evropa je treća strana. I kao da su Amerika i Rusija zapravo sada bliže jedna drugoj nego Evropa i Amerika.
I think that Putin may be closer to Trump, but I concur with your assessment, because what the European powers, specifically Germany, the United Kingdom, and France, are doing is sustaining the Obama-Biden agenda, namely that the war against Russia should go on. And it's also part of what was called the project of the new American century, which I mentioned earlier. Another observation is the fact that these politicians are not independent, and they're certainly not committed to peace. They are responding to the pressures of the economic elites, and specifically of the military-industrial complex, which is not limited to the United States. And many of the European companies have partners in the United States, particularly Italy, Germany, and of course the United Kingdom. I don't know what the future, what is going to happen, but I don't think that Trump will terminate his mandate.
A da li će se, dakle, dogovoriti Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping o novom svetu, a Evropa će biti jedan, ajde da kažemo, izopštenik, jedan da kažemo, igrač koji je izgubio utakmicu, a koji i dalje želi da igra?
Well, I think we have to understand this concept of world governance, which has largely been put forth by the economic elites. Now, I recall the statement of the late David Rockefeller, who made the statement as follows, that world government would be based on an alliance between bankers and intellectuals. And then he said this is much more efficient than the democratic governments which prevail.
Vas su optužili, evo i danas, ako odemo na Google, na Wikipediju i čitamo o vama kao jedna, da kažemo, jedna platforma globalizma, piše da ste vi teoretičar zavere, da dovodite u sumnju zvanične podatke, kako oni kažu, istinu i tako dalje, i da zapravo, a vi zapravo nudite istinu i nudite ono što svako ko iole razmišlja u svetu može da zaključi. Dakle, da nije onako kako nam predstavlja ta duboka država.
Well, I think the truth is ultimately the basis for world peace. And there's a process which is occurring right now, is that the lie is replacing the truth. And as I've often said, when the lie becomes the truth, there's no moving backwards. I don't think we have reached that point. But at the same time, it's very clear that the Western media is targeting journalism. I can recall a period when we didn't even talk about independent media. And that really coincides to the period of the Cold War, early 90s, and it is then that we had a surge in independent media, and also with the system of communication on the internet. I don't wish to personalize, but I collaborated with the mainstream media for 30 years. And particularly in Canada, the CBC and the Radio-Canada, they would call me up every week to come to do a commentary and so on. And then I was linked up to the Monde Diplomatique for 10 years. And then I realized that the war in Yugoslavia against Yugoslavia was really a breaking point. And that is specifically when the mainstream media started extensively to focus on disinformation. And then, of course, after 9/11, this gained a new impetus. I had a very sort of conventional career in the sense that I worked for the World Bank, for the United Nations, for the Canadian government, for the media, and so on. And at a time when debate and dialogue were accepted.
Ali da li je sada veća cenzura, obzirom da mi imamo mogućnost pristupa ovim medijima, znači imamo internet, imamo mnogo portala, sajtova, društvenih mreža, raznih video kanala, YouTube-a i tako dalje, ali da ipak sada mogućnost kontrole veća nego pre.
Well, for people who are seeking the truth, we have a lot more information, obviously. Which we didn't have previously. We have information with regard to declassified documents. We can scan the internet, searching, and most of our information comes from mainstream or government sources.
Ali ne u Srbiji.
No, you're right. I think in Serbia there was also a certain element where media was protected and independent media was protected. We have so much information that this COVID crisis is part of the broader agenda. And I have been investigating that right from the beginning. I've brought out a book. It hasn't been published in English, but my Japanese publisher has brought it out. The lies are so obvious, but yet they are not revealed to the public.
Da, mi smo to imali, dakle to je bio samo jedan deo plana. Znamo šta je Tedros radio u Etiopiji kao ministar zdravlja i uz pomoć Bill Gates fondacije.
Well, you knew about it. A lot of people knew about it. But the thing is that when the lockdown and the pandemic was announced, and he made an announcement on February 20th, 2020, and he made it in such a way, he said, this is very dangerous. The windows are closing. And essentially he said, the pandemic is coming. How many cases were there on February 20th? For 6.4 billion people, 1,076. But it was even less than that because, and he acknowledged it, 60% were people who were stranded in the Diamond Princess cruise in the territorial waters of Japan, and they got sick because they were confined to the cabins. So it was only something like 450 cases worldwide out of China. And then on March 11, the proposal was the lockdown, the closure of, essentially the closure of 190 economies, justified as a means to combat the virus. Let me explain. When you confine people to their homes and you freeze the workplace, the result is obvious. It's collapse. It's collapse of the global economy, not total collapse. And it is applied simultaneously in 190 countries.
A da li mislite da će sada, prvo evo da vas pitam, da li mislite da će ove godine biti završen ovaj rat u Ukrajini koji takođe predstavlja jednu vrstu opterećenja svetu?
I can't answer that question, but I can say that already the Ukrainian economy has more or less been taken over by the big portfolio companies such as BlackRock and Vanguard. And they've already signed an agreement on that. And what the powerful financial elites want is essentially to privatize Ukraine as a territory. And I think that essentially that is the tendency at the world level. It has already been applied in the developing countries. In other words, the countries are indebted to such an extent that they are then precipitated into into negotiating with the creditors and ultimately handing over their country on a silver plate to the capitalist elites. That's really what it is. It's something which is historically very significant because the nation state no longer exists. What you have is a portfolio company which owns the country. And in other words, the tendency is it's a new form of colonialism. It's a new form of colonialism, quite distinct from the British Empire, which had a certain flexibility. They negotiated with monarchies and so on. But here, what we have is corporate, a company which owns vast amount of territory, and the state more or less disappears. It is then taken over by the Washington Consensus, namely the World Bank and the IMF and so on. I would like to emphasize also that the whole political apparatus is criminalized, and the whole economic apparatus is criminalized. Now, you probably know that the head of the European Central Bank has a criminal record with the French government. But what you may not notice is that the signature of Christine Lagarde, who was condemned to 1 year of prison by French judges, and who was formerly the head of the IMF. There you are at the top of the 20 euros. Her signature is there, Christine Lagarde. Now that sets a precedent where somebody with a criminal record provides legitimacy to 20 euros.
A da li će, evo, sada smo pričali o Ukrajini, da li Srbija ima priliku da reši neke svoje probleme, pre svega, da kažemo, teritorijalne, u kontekstu mogućnosti promene granica? Da li su Trump i Putin spremni da menjaju granice i na Balkanu, i da li Srbija može da bude neko ko će profitirati od toga, obzirom da prema Rusiji nije uvela sankcije, a da s druge strane ima određen stepen saradnje sa Washingtonom?
Well, I think that there's a personal relationship with between President Vučić on the one hand and the son-in-law of Donald Trump, and I listened to their discourse and their exchange. I think from that standpoint, often personal relations are there to establish dialogue. Personally, I think that, and this is my own assessment, but it might be favored by the Trump administration. First of all, it is very important to look at the historical process on how Milosevic was imprisoned and was assassinated, and then 10 years later they say he's innocent. Okay? What this really means is that the Hague Tribunal is also criminalized, because on the one hand, they didn't allow him to have a fair trial. They denied his right of self-defense, and they killed him. And on the other hand, you have the real criminals, including Hashim Tashi, who were known to Interpol and maybe also to Madeleine Albright, okay, that Hashim Tashi was a criminal, and he was then sent to The Hague more than 20 years later. And why is it they didn't arrest him immediately? Because they are now accusing him of crimes which he committed in the 1990s. I think in that regard that the Serbian government should demand the extradition of Hashim Tashi, who he's a bad guy, but he's also a citizen of Serbia, right? And that he be referred to a Serbian court under Serbian laws.
Šta bi bilo rešenje za Kosovo? Dakle, da li Srbija može da, ako bude imala volju, to moramo da dodamo, da vrati Kosovo i Metohiju u svoju jurisdikciju?
Just an element which is important. You might have heard of Frank Gardner Wisner, Sr. He was responsible for the 1953 coup d'etat in Iran. His son, Frank Wisner Jr., was responsible, who became a very notorious member of the intelligence establishment. He was involved in a number of actions, including Obama sent him to Egypt during the Arab Spring, but that was in 2011. Prior to that, he came to Kosovo to establish the legal framework to declare Kosovo as an independent state and so on and so forth. And the question is, those procedures, which then led to a so-called government in Kosovo, first elected criminal number one, Hashim Tashi. That is a mafia state set up by U.S. intelligence, and bond steal is totally illegal. I think that the Serbian government should certainly, and I think they should demand the closure of bond steal, particularly in view of the fact that Trump wants to save money. And you might say, well, this is the most expensive base in Europe, and one of the biggest. And what is the use of this base? So I think that the fact that a former president and former officials, because he's not alone in The Hague, have been sent to The Hague for crimes that they committed in the 90s, reflects on the fact that this is not a legal government, and it is a state established with the advice of a senior member of U.S. intelligence. That is certainly important, but it should be negotiated. But it should also follow suit to the fact that the European Union is heavily militarized. And these are facilities which go back to the end of World War II. They go back to the Cold War era.
Pitao bih vas kao Kanađanina, koliko je realno da Trump može da uradi aneksiju Kanade i Grenlanda?
I think that Trump is ignorant. We are already in a situation whereby Canada can be invaded by land, sea, and air as part of an agreement which was reached about 20 years ago. In 2007, it's called U.S. Northern Command. Now, this integration is from the military standpoint, but what it says is that it was Rumsfeld which made the declaration. I think it was in 2000. I think it was in 2002, and he said, "We are now establishing U.S. Northern Command, which extends from the southern border of Mexico right up to the Arctic." I can say, first of all, very few people know about this in Canada. They don't know that their country is open for invasion, and that it doesn't have the status of invasion. It has the status of the fact that they can come into Canada and say, well, Bin Laden is up in the North Pole and we must go after him. And that means that all the rivers but all the land in the Northwest Territories are essentially under U.S. military auspices. Now, our former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien made a statement recently saying that we have disputes with the United States with regard to territorial waters. But it's much more serious than that, because they have military control over the entire country.
Kandidat za premijera, Pierre Poilievre, i njegova, da kažemo, saborka iz liberalne partije Kanade, Chrystia Freeland, se slažu u stavu da je Amerika postala predator, da Kanada treba da postane novi lider slobodnog sveta i da je potrebno da napravi vojni sporazum sa Velikom Britanijom i Francuskom o nuklearnom oružju i sa Danskom da se pripremi za odbranu od američke invazije.
Well, the new Prime Minister of Canada is Mark Carney, and he was the former governor of the Bank of England, and he was also former governor of the Bank of Canada. He is an instrument of the financial establishment, both in Europe as well as in North America, but specifically it's an Anglo-American perspective. He has never been involved in politics, but he was chosen by the very powerful financial interests, first to serve in the Bank of England, which was in violation of a precedent which goes back almost 400 years. We've never have a foreigner sitting in the Bank of England. I have British citizenship as well. And at the time when he was nominated for the Bank of England, he didn't even have the right of residence in the United Kingdom. Fortunately, his wife is British. So he comes and sets a whole series of concepts. He's in favor of the climate agenda. In other words, going after CO2. He's in favor of the cities, what is it called? These intelligent cities. But he's also there to antagonize Trump, and well, we'll have to see how things evolve. But he certainly has taken a stance against the 25 taxation, which I don't think will ever be implemented.
Evo, hteo bih da vam se zahvalim na ovom intervjuu i da li imate za kraj neku poruku srpskom narodu?
Well, I must say that's at a personal level. I feel that this country has a way of, well, it goes back in time, but it's the sense of friendship and solidarity, and that they will want to break that, huh? And I think what is very important is that certain features of the Yugoslav model should be restored. We can't necessarily go back in history, but we can also learn from some lessons of the Yugoslav period with a view to, say, protecting our own industries, redeveloping an industrial base, that's very important, restoring the État-providence, that's the term in French, with regard to health, education, culture, establishing conditions whereby people will have higher incomes, control over energy. There are many different things that could be done. I have been here for now 2 weeks, and I think many Serbians are concerned that they can't pay their rent, and they may not have enough money for food, and at the same time there's a certain preference which is given to foreign capital. And I say among those elements there's room for progress, and the history of Yugoslavia and of the war against Yugoslavia and the war against Serbia should be integrated into the schools and universities in a way which is far more consistent what it is now. But that is because of propaganda, and somehow an entire generation which were born after the war of 1999, or when they were very young, they do not understand what happened. And it's people within my age bracket which know the truth. I think what is very important is to maintain the legacy of Milosevic. And that is also because he confronted the judicial process, and he confronted the judicial process referring to international law. I think I'd like to conclude on that. International law we can trust. We have a genocide convention where it says whoever is complicit in genocide can be sent to jail, imprisoned. Anybody who is complicit. And that there are the laws of armed conflict, which say that any act of killing civilians is a criminal act. And that means that the two main courts, whether it's the International Criminal Court or the Court of Justice, both of these entities are criminalized, and that's something that is something which Milosevic understood, and because he was confronting the criminality of the Hague Tribunal.
Hvala vam mnogo.
Thank you.
Hvala i vama na pažnji, gledali ste intervju produkcije Balkan Info, prijatno.
Hvala svima koji verno prate naše emisije i žele da pomognu u radu naše produkcije. Možete nas podržati simboličnom donacijom ili kupovinom naših proizvoda na sajtu balkaninfo.rs.